I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping, gathering firewood for my grandmother, because it was getting dark outside. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles per hour, I started getting this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't." I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest. Then, it completely stopped when I heard a tap tap on my window. My uncle sped up and started praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on until our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me," and "Don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe, and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around. It was quiet, besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces." I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer until we got to my grandmother's house. I called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit, and he said, "I didn't see faces, just eyes, like brake lights that you see on the road. It was looking at you." Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" But he didn't laugh. He just stayed silent and said, "Because it wasn't alone." Living in a small town has its advantages. For example, you get to know everyone who lives there pretty quickly. If you ever have a problem, chances are that there's someone in town with the expertise to help you. Like Jimmy, our local handyman, electrician, and plumber. If you have a household problem, Jimmy's your guy. If you got a more difficult problem, then you probably want Mac. He's our town sheriff, the only law enforcement we have for a few miles. Are you feeling hungry? Then Sherry's the gal for you. She runs a diner in the center of town, and her pie is out of this world. What I'm trying to say is that it pays to know people. Another thing I find fantastic about living in a small town is the sheer amount of nature that surrounds us, untouched by man. The trees seem to grow endlessly into the sky. The nearby creek is crystal clear, not like those contaminated ones I hear about in the city. But I think the best part about living so far away from the city is the peace and quiet. It's intoxicating. Occasionally, sometimes you'll hear the rumbling of a semi-truck passing by, but that's about it. You could step outside your door at any given time and be greeted with pure silence. I have always found the silence peaceful, like our town was secretly tucked away from the rest of the world. Even though I do enjoy the peace and quiet, that's not always the case for a lot of people. I work in the only gas station for miles, and we often get a lot of people stopping by there to refuel before heading back onto the road. Even though most of the people tend to fill up at the pump and continue their journey, sometimes I'll still get people to come inside, and they'll mention how unnaturally quiet it is in this town. Since I only lived in this town my entire life, I never noticed how different it is from the rest of the world. But I'll just take their word for it. It just makes me uneasy, is what one of the customers said to me when I inquired. They said they couldn't put their finger on it. Just something about the silence of our town made them uncomfortable. Well, this town makes me uncomfortable too, but it's not the silence that drives my fear. It's something that happened to me when I was a kid. My friend Tommy and I were always together as children. We would do everything together, explore the forest, fish in the creek, play in one of the many meadows that littered our town until the moon signaled our curfew. It was early October when it happened. We were playing together as usual, riding bikes up and down the town, until he got the bright idea to pay a visit to the Blackbriar farm. Now, this farm has a bit of history. but I'll try to sum it up. Basically, the Blackbriars were the first to settle in this town. They were a working class family, and their main export was corn. They had cornfields as far as the eye could see. The town itself was in the early stages of forming next to the farm. Then one day, in the middle of October, the entire Blackbriar family disappeared. Nobody knew why. Some people said that the head of the household, Michael Blackbriar, took sick and passed away, and at that point, the farm was too much to maintain without him, so his family left the farm for greener fields. Others think a pack of wolves or some other animal got to the family and tore them apart, and they were never seen again. Regardless of what happened, the farm was abandoned and had been left untouched for decades. For some reason, our town either didn't have the will or the means to tear the farm down and start something new, so the old farmhouse was just left, standing there. Even though the house remained empty, the cornfield seemed to continue to grow year after year. They would produce, and even our local market owner would pick fresh corn from the field and use it. There's no point in letting it go to waste, they would say. Then the field would wither and die, only to regrow all over again the following year. So Tommy wanted to go exploring in the field. He had this absurd notion that the Blackbriars had a stash of treasure somewhere on the farm itself. After all, they were a supplier of produce for a while, and the town didn't have a bank during those times, so they had to do something with all that money. Well, the sun was quickly setting as we approached the edge of the farm. Reluctantly, I followed Tommy into the looming forest of dried corn husk. Our footsteps crunched beneath us as we marched further inward. It was deafening how loud our footsteps were in comparison to the rest of our surroundings. As we pressed on, we began to hear a new sound. It was faint, over the crunch of our footfalls at first, but as we walked closer, the sound grew louder. It was crying. Someone was sitting in the cornfield, softly crying to themselves. Unsure of the situation, I asked Tommy if we could head back, but he shook his head, mentioning that someone might need our help. We found ourselves in a small clearing in the field. On the other side from where we entered, we saw it, or I should say, her. It was a woman. She was sitting on the cold ground. She was wearing a silky white dress, which had been stained by the dirt she rested on. Long brownish black hair covered her face and shoulders. She sat facing away from us, and the sobs that she was doing seemed to reverberate off the surrounding stalks of corn. Tommy fearlessly approached her and asked her if she was alright. When he did, her sobs instantly stopped, and the overwhelming silence returned. She rose to her feet, still facing away from us. I took a step backward, while Tommy took a step ahead. Then she turned, but how she did it triggered alarms off in my head. 1 second, she was facing away, and in the blink of an eye, she was turned towards us, as if she were a glitch in a video game. She raised her head, and her hair parted from her face, revealing a gory facade. Its flesh clung to her skull like tape. Half of her jawbone was exposed. Her eyes were gray and lifeless. Dirt seemed to pepper the remaining parts of her skin, which combined to form a sickly brownish color. Tommy and I both screamed. I immediately turned to run away, but then I heard Tommy call out to me. My body reacted on its own, and I turned back. Tommy had been grabbed. Her hand gripped his wrist so tight that even from where I was standing, I could hear the bones in Tommy's wrist begin to splinter. Her mouth began to open and separate, as if she were some sort of snake-like creature. She pulled him closer and raised him up. Tommy struggled to turn his head away from the creature to look at me, and managed to say one thing to me, the last thing I would ever hear from my best friend. "Run!" And I did. I ran through the cornfield as fast as I could. Tears streamed down my face like a waterfall as I realized I left my best friend behind to die. I made it to my bike and pedaled as fast as I could to the police station. I told Mac everything that happened. He quickly gathered up a search party, and it was almost every single person in town. After going through the cornfield for hours, they found no trace of the woman, and the only thing they found of Tommy's was a shoe. Weeks turned into months, which turned into years. Eventually, everyone in the town started to forget. It was just another tragic missing child's case to everyone, aside from Tommy's parents and myself, that is. New children began telling stories about the cornfield, how anyone who goes in is never heard from again. Those stories aren't entirely accurate, because I was there with Tommy that day, and I made it out, alive. Not a single day goes by that I don't regret what I did, and not a single night goes by that I don't have to drink myself into a drunken slumber. Ever since I started working at this gas station, I saved up enough money to move away from this town for good, to start a new life somewhere, far away, away from the cornfield, and away from the tragic memory of my dear friend. I plan on leaving at the end of October, but 2 nights ago, after I was closing up the gas station, I heard it. The silence broken by some faint sobs coming from the other side of the road. My body seized as I saw her, standing there on the other side of the road. I wanted to believe that I was just seeing things, but I knew better than that. She was facing away from me, and without even giving her a second to turn around, I ran to my car, got inside, and drove away. I'm at home right now, and I wanted to type this up before I leave this place for good, just so whoever hears this knows how sorry I am for Tommy, and to stay away from the Blackbriar farm. I'm not really sure where I'm gonna go, but I need to hurry. I left my window open, and I think I just heard some crying coming from outside. So if I don't make it, remember, if you hear a woman softly crying to herself, just stay away and call the police, or you might end up just like my best friend, Tommy. Hey everyone, in the upcoming story, I just want to give everybody a fair warning that strong language is used throughout the story. As you all know, this isn't my typical style. I have chosen to preserve the original writer's words, to maintain the story the most original that I can. So again, please be aware that the story contains strong language. If you feel like skipping the story, I have included some timestamps down below in the description. Again, thank you all so much for listening. Happy Thanksgiving. I think there is something living or walking around in my ex-best friend's skin. I will tell the tale and the nopes that led up to it. It was July last year. Me and my friend are both 18. Decided to go camping for a week. End up not liking any of the lame, paid campsites. We are doing this the old way, goddammit. Illegally camping in this amazing area. Far away from houses and properties. The nearest town is at least half an hour drive away. Fuck snakes and spiders. We're both Australian. The first few days of camping are great though. It was pretty rainy. Every night we end up talking for hours and being hilarious. Then go to sleep in a massive swag that I brought. The place is great, but for some reason we stick together. It made me uneasy to be alone, and for some reason, we always made sure we were within viewing distance of one another. One night, we ended up huddled in fear. We could hear something walking around the fucking swag. Walks around us for hours while we both nope the fuck out of there. Then we hear a fucked up screech from a distance. Noise like wind going past really fast and footsteps stomping. We're camped in a clearing. No wind can get through the trees like that. It hasn't this whole time. My friend then starts laughing. Holy fuck, man. That was scary as fuck. We end up eventually going to sleep. The next day I'm cooking. Oh shit, we need more firewood. Can't leave this food because it'll burn really fast. My friend volunteers. First time one of us has gone into the wooded area alone. My friend pauses before going in. Finally summons some fucking courage and disappears from sight. I'm a fucking master chef. Not wearing my watch, but it's been like an hour. I'm nearly done cooking the stuff. I assume he's taking a shit, so I'll give that fucker some privacy. The fire begins to fail, so I have to ninja get some wood and finish the meal. Eventually, I realize maybe some inbred fuckers have raped and ate my friend. Damn it, I spent ages cooking this meal. I grab my big ass knife, rifle, torch, and a bite of my delicious damper. I walk into the woods yelling for my friend, but I feel something watching me. I begin to get scared, but I'm not about to admit it. Come out, you fucker. It doesn't take that long to shit. Then I see someone in the woods in front of me. And then I hear my friend laugh. But at the same time, I hear a screech behind me. Oh, fuck that. I started running straight towards where I saw my friend. That fucker is unarmed. As I'm running, I lose sight of my friend. I called out to him, "Motherfucker, if you're dead, I will kill you." I end up breaking through the wooded area into a padlock. I see something move in the woods across the padlock. It looks big. Bigger than me. I start to consider how many bullets I have. Probably not enough. I run back through the woods to get to the campsite. And my friend is sitting there, wearing a change of clothes. Holy fuck, man. That was scary as fuck. He laughs. Oh wait, did you hear the screech? He shakes his head. Fuck, I must be paranoid. So we dig into some delicious food. I tell him about the huge thing that I saw, and he just starts laughing again and says, I wouldn't worry about it. That night, I'm sitting across from my friend in front of a fire. I decided to teach myself whittling, so I start to whittle away. I cut my thumb. I stick a band-aid on that shit and continue to whittle. He's reading a book and has a little light with him. The wood start rustling and shit. The crickets start chirping, but they start chirping away. My friend then starts to laugh at something that he's reading. Then I think about his laugh in the woods. I realize it's the same exact laugh as the one when the thing walked around the swag. The same laugh that he did just then. Same as the first thing he said when I found him with different clothes on back at the camp. He also said the same words. Weird. I eventually decide to drink a bit, but he's a lightweight. We both crawl into the swag laughing. I have the knife attached to my belt. Then, at some point in the night, I wake up and I find him staring at me. My drunk brain suddenly worried that he might be going homo for a second while drunk. I start to talk about this girl that I really like. He seems to be really aware and listening to everything I say. Suddenly, I feel like my bladder is gonna burst. I stagger out this little river that goes past our campsite. I take a piss in the early morning light while I'm in awe of the majesty of nature. That's when I see something gray sticking out of the riverbed. I go over and pull it out. It's the shirt that my friend was wearing yesterday before going into the woods. It's torn up pretty bad, with a little bit of blood on it. But I'm too drunk to really put anything together. I rebury it, because my drunk brain thinks putting the cotton back to nature to decompose is a great idea. I clean my hands on my pants. I climb back into the swag, and I realize that my friend has fucking gone to La La Land. I pass out and wake up a couple of hours later. My friend is still asleep. I begin to have a feeling about weird shit that's been happening. I realize that the fire needs restarting, while pushing the coals and ashes around to add more wood. I find the button of the pants that he was wearing yesterday, and a bit of a gray cotton fabric, like the stuff from his shirt. What the fuck? Today is the day we pack up and leave. When my friend wakes up, he's being as weird as he was yesterday. I start to pack, and he gives me a weird look, so I just tell him to start helping me. He then gets to asking if I can go get some firewood because he's hungry. I tell the bitch once we're done packing, I hold his hand and go into the woods with him. Once we packed up, we both carry shit up to the car, which is hidden up near the bush track to get out of here. I check my car every day, and he follows the whole way because the dumb fuck has probably forgotten where it's at. We load up the car. I turn it on to make sure it's all good. I'm able to tune the radio, but there's a weather warning about storms hitting the area. We go back to the campsite to grab the last stuff. Can we go get firewood now? He asked. My friend is standing just inside the edge of the woods. Suddenly, I get this feeling deep in my stomach, like fear or something. I really want to get the fuck out of here. Nah, I don't think so. There's a weather warning. We can eat some food we got left over, and we'll buy something hot when we hit the next town. It's an 8-hour drive home. While I finish up packing, he doesn't even eat anything, but the fucker has been acting weird. I then ask him if he's alright. Yeah, I'm fine. Are you sure we can't stay another night though? I don't think the storm is gonna hit here. That's when I see something move in the woods behind him. What the fuck is that? He doesn't turn around. I pull out my knife and for some reason he goes almost into a defensive pose. He gives me a weird look. Dude, there was something fucking behind you. He turns around and says, I'm sure it was nothing. While we walk up to the car, he looks behind us a few times. So I'm trying to act normal because he sure isn't. So when I was cleaning up the fire, I noticed bits of your clothes in there. He says he wrecked them while collecting firewood and didn't want to add to the rubbish to bring back. Fucking weirdo, dude. You never done shit like that before. He shrugs and looks around as we get up to the car. That's when I feel like something is watching me. But once we're in the car and back out the road, I started to feel better. I keep trying to make conversation, but he doesn't put much into the conversation. I turn on the radio. Every so often he repeats things some of the radio presenters say. While we aren't talking, I have time to think about it. Him not worry about anything is what starts to worry me. I start to think about the weird looks he's been giving me in different situations. I feel sick and horrified, and I realize the faces are most likely the faces I was putting at him at those moments. He's been mimicking my expressions. Realize he's been repeating phrases I say, and his laugh doesn't even change. His clothes all torn up and him trying to bury them, finding them burnt after I found them, wanting me to go back into the creepy fucking woods for some reason. I decide to give a little test. Talk about some stupid shit we did as kids. So I start to ask questions. And he just says, oh, I don't remember that part. Or just simply agrees with me. The more I think about it, I start to realize that he hasn't been acting like himself at all since he went missing while I was cooking. When we finally get to a town, I turn my phone on and I call my mom. She's glad we had fun and stuff. She can't wait for us to get back into town and spend some time with her before I go back to work. I ask him if he's gonna call his parents, and he gives me a weird look again. Then he gets his phone from his backpack. I then grab money from our joint cash fund and buy us both lunch. He eats the almost raw steak from his burger, but doesn't want his chips or the rest of the bun or salad. He then goes in. He then comes out with 2 more big pieces of red steak, done rare. He starts to wolf those fuckers down while I finish my meal. He then pulls out his phone again and fires off some texts. That's when I notice some wicked bruises covering his upper arms. What the fuck happened there, man? He shrugs and says that they don't hurt. Well, okay then. I then change clothes and shower there. And he is waiting by the car. I notice him staring and watching other people, and he says he doesn't want to shower. I call him a smelly fucker and he disappears for a bit. He comes back with new clothes, and he even smells like he took a shower. So then we keep on driving, and it's now nighttime, only an hour or two out away from home. He slowly begins to join in the conversation, but he doesn't sound the same as he used to. None of his speech habits are the same. No talking about the girl he's crazy about. I decide to bring up the creepy shit that happened out at the campsite. I swear, I thought about shooting that horse or whatever that big thing was out there. But I decided I like my chances of not knowing. And he starts to laugh and says, I wouldn't worry about that. I begin to feel uneasy and think that maybe this isn't my friend next to me anymore. What about that thing that walked around our tent? He gives me this weird smile. Maybe it was a werewolf. I laugh. Or a hot chick who was lost. He grins wider. Or maybe something that was just checking us out. I then feel weird again, so I force a laugh. Why would anything do that? Like some cannibal or rapist? He looks out the window, and I can't watch him because I gotta keep my eyes on the road. Maybe they wanted to get out of there, as badly as you did this morning, he says. What the fuck did he just say? I glance at him, but he's not looking at me. I can feel my knife on my hip in its holster, the rifle stored away in the back, like a Skinwalker or some shit. Something like that, he says. We both go silent. Then he starts to laugh, and it's the same fucking laugh. But that would be impossible, right? I laugh. The radio goes on, and we don't even talk for the rest of the drive. I get to his house. I start to help him get his shit out of my car, and then I drive home. As I get inside, I start to shake. I'm a man, for fuck's sake. Keep it together, motherfucker. Seriously, I think my friend died out there, and there is something else living inside of him now. Not only this, but weird shit has been happening. Like his dog and cat have mysteriously disappeared. He doesn't even hang out with us as much anymore. And even the girl he liked tried to hang out with him, and she says he was really fucking weird. He apparently acts almost robotic, and only eats hardly cooked meat like a fucking caveman. His mom even asked him if he had gotten into any fights, because his skin is always bruised. Now he could have joined a fight club or something, but honestly, my best friend is a totally different guy now. The craziest thing is that he recently invited me to go camping again, to the same fucking spot. I had to say I was busy, but I'm terrified that maybe there was more than one, and when he tried to get me to go out into the woods with him, he was trying to draw me out there for the same thing to happen to me. This shit's so fucked. I ignore his calls now, and whenever I get back from a swing at work, all I get is complaints about his weird behavior, and people asking if he's on drugs or some shit. For God's sake, I told my friends to never take him up on a camping idea, and I told the girl I liked, who is now my girlfriend, that all this weird shit that's happened, and she agrees that he is a totally different person. He was a stand-up guy who was hilarious and laid back, and now he is almost malicious and uncaring, and sometimes I can hear that fucking laugh in my head, and that fucking screech, and it sucks. Being terrified of some asshole that I used to love like my own brother. And so this concludes this fucked up story of me being convinced that my friend is no longer human or who he used to be. I have never in my life seen anyone change like that. Some days I just fucking nope the whole thing and hope that I'm just crazy and that he's just gone on some sort of hardcore drugs. I should have asked them things that only he would know. Lie about something. Make him agree with you. And there you go. A better way to tell. Or just come clean with everything and see if he admits it in arrogance. That's pretty much what I did, and that's what set it off for me. The stupid shit we did as kids was like putting this purple goo into these girls' hair. He loves to tell that story because in order to get rid of the blame on us, we put it in our own hair so we wouldn't get in trouble and they wouldn't tell. While we were driving, I asked him if he remembered putting goo into girls' hair. He said yes. I asked him if he remembered if it was green or blue or purple, and he said he didn't remember, but was pretty sure it was green. Now, there is no fucking way he forgot. No fucking way. He fucking told that story a couple of weeks before we went down there. I also decided to ask him about his first dog, Mo. He didn't remember shit about Mo. In fact, it made me so fucking sick of his vague fucking responses that I stopped before he realized I was getting upset. And God knows what would have happened if it realized what I was doing. But I assume it can read, and it also learns very fast, like his phone. When I told him to call his parents, he treated his phone like he had no fucking idea. But then, by the time that I bought food, he was already texting people, and then how he was copying my expressions and other people's and the radio's talk. It was so fucking scary, man. Maybe it makes me an asshole for being willing to drop a friendship that I had pretty much my whole life over these experiences. But honestly, what am I supposed to do? Hello, officers. When I was on a camping trip with my best friend last year, we spent a good amount of the time drinking and camping on illegal ground. I'm pretty sure something ate the insides of my friend, and is now wearing him as a meat suit. You can just imagine the laugh that I would get, right? From what I know, he hasn't attacked anyone physically, or asked anyone else to go camping with him. So be careful if somebody ever goes into the woods and they come back a different person. Many of you who love paranormal stuff may have already heard of the word nagual here in Mexico, and I would guess that also on some other countries in Latino America we call that way people who can shapeshift into animals. Well, here's my story. It was a cold night, I remember, because it was really weird for it to get cold on that side of the country. This was in my parents' house, in a small pueblo, or small town, and back in the day, it was one of the last houses outside of town. Not so many neighbors, but a lot of trees and nature around. The house has a long backyard where we used to have sheep. At one side, a small water stream and trees to the other side. The sheep then started to bleat very loud, something we could call screams. My father then went to give a check on a window in the back side of the house. I still recall his face when he came back quickly, and in a low, urgent voice, he told my mom, "Ve agarra a tu padre y a tus hermanos y diles que vengan ya ahorita. Go ask your father and brothers to come here immediately." They were 4 brothers, my grandfather and my father. When everyone was there, a few minutes later, my father started to tell us what he saw. In the barn, we had 10 sheep. At the moment my father gave a look, all of them were together in just one corner. At the center, there was some kind of big animal. My father described it as a bear, which makes totally no sense, but he said it was big, hairy, and it seemed to be eating one sheep there. This one sheep was screaming really bad. Then, my grandfather told my mom to keep us inside of the house, and to keep me in there also with her. If you go outside now, you may catch a bad air. So he made some kind of prayer, holding his machete. So his prayer, I remember he said the names of my uncles, and also my father's. He then went outside. That's when my grandfather started to yell at the darkness, telling things like, "Vete de aquí, no tienes nada que ver aquí. Deja esta casa. Go away, you have nothing to do here. Leave this house." My father told me that he saw how this thing was in a pose. eating the sheep, which was laying on the ground, still screaming by the way. And when my grandfather yelled at it, this thing seemed to stop and raise its head up towards my family. This thing was only staring at them. Not a single noise, and also no red or shining eyes, only the shadow looked like it was looking at them. So my father decided to do something at last. He took a big rock, he picked it up from the ground and threw it at this thing. Maybe not the best thing to do in this situation, but I guess this thing was not that strong. Or maybe because it was 6 of us and we all had machetes. But when the rock hit it, this being turned its back and ran away to the forest, running on all 4 legs like an animal would. They then approached the sheep, and my grandpa said how the sheep was on the ground, but it was still alive, but it was completely unskinned. It was horrifying, at least. My grandfather then sacrificed it to stop the suffering. After that night, a family friend told us a story about someone new in town that apparently was a naguat. He told us he spoke to that man and he told him to leave the town. Indeed, we never happened to live something similar after that. I saw some videos about skinwalkers on TikTok, so I started watching videos about them on YouTube, and there was a whole podcast where this guy just read stories about them from Reddit and other stories that people submitted. Our ward at church purchased a piece of land way back in the day. It's seriously just wooded area with a little bit of swamp. We would always go there for campouts and scouts, and at night, when it was pitch black, we would all play manhunt. Well, one time, we all got down to one person whose name was David. Growing up, he was super fast, and he would hide really good, so nobody could ever find him. He would always end up being the last person. Well, one time, it was down to David, and we had split up and gone way deep in the forest towards the swamp because it seems like it was impossible to find him. We thought he might have gone a little bit further than we normally go. We started getting into some more muddy and wet terrain as we get closer to a swamp-like area where the water is most likely shin deep, and we saw David way out in the swamp, and he wasn't wearing a shirt. And with the spotlight on him, he looked super pale, but he just stood there and didn't say a word. You could seriously tell something was off. Then, all of a sudden, we heard David from behind us, yelling, trying to get our attention, so we would keep trying to chase him down. Meaning, what we saw in front of us was definitely not him. So being a bunch of 12 to 17-year-old boys, we started yelling and running back to the campsite as fast as we could. Nobody believed us. In fact, for years everybody made fun of it, calling the ghost of David. But then I started listening to these stories, and every single one of them sounds just like what happened in some way or another. I'm going to start this off by saying it's a long read, but it's worth it. My friend and I were talking about this creepy experience we had, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. So I figured I'll turn to Reddit for some answers, if there are any. People might think that this is fake, but I don't care, whether you believe it or not. I have no clue if this animal or creature is a skinwalker, or just a very creepy animal. This took place around 2019, and I do live in Tennessee, right on the outskirts of the Appalachian Mountains. So here it goes. Two of my friends and I were driving on a desolated back road at night. We were jamming to music and talking. Everything was normal. I was driving. My friend Hannah was in the passenger seat, being the DJ, and our friend Chris was in the back seat behind me. Hannah was trying to pull up a song on YouTube that wasn't on Spotify, so it was silent for a bit. While she was waiting on the website to load, Chris and I were still talking. We then came up on a small animal in the road, but I didn't think anything of it. Well, I expected the animal to move pretty quickly once it saw us coming down the road, but it didn't. As I got closer, I slowed down to let the animal have enough time to run off, but it still stayed very still. It almost looked frozen, and the closer I got, I could make out that it looked like some kind of cat. The only thing was, it didn't look like any sort of cat I ever seen. It looked like it had fur, but the fur was flesh colored. Its ears were very small, almost like the ears of a kitten, even though it was only a tiny bit bigger than a house cat. It was laying in a way that looked like the Sphinx was facing us. The scariest thing about it, though, was its eyes. Not to sound over dramatic, but its eyes literally looked like the pits of hell were burning inside of them. They were bright red, orange-like, and had twinkles of yellow in them that reflected off the headlights. As we got closer, the whole car was silent, and I just stared ahead. This cat scared the shit out of me, and it still wasn't moving. I felt a huge pit in my stomach and began having intense anxiety. It was almost like I was frozen, but I was not about to stop to figure out what this cat was. At this point, I had to steer around a bit to pass it without hitting it. I was like 3 inches away from touching this thing, and as I slowly crept by it, I watched it through the window the entire time. And it didn't even flinch, and the eyes still had the same glow, even without my headlights directly on it. After we passed it, about 5 seconds later, Chris yells, "What the fuck was that?" I immediately start freaking out and shout, "I don't know." Hannah looks up from her phone and says, What did y'all see?" She looked behind us and kept asking. We explained what happened, and she said, "I didn't see anything behind us." Chris and I looked back, and sure enough, it was gone. We drove up the road to a church and turned around in the parking lot. We now wanted to get back to Hannah's as soon as possible. When we got back, we rushed in and told her mom what we saw. But we didn't mention that it looked like a cat. We described it as a small animal. Her mother stops for a minute and says, "Was it a cat?" We were blown away. We told her it was. And she said that her and a cousin came across the same exact thing when they were teens, only it was in a different area, and they saw it peeking out of the bushes. She still to this day doesn't know what it was, and she said that she thinks about it from time to time, even after 30 years. So I guess I want to know a few things. What was this? It didn't look like a bobcat, mountain lion, or fox. Is it a demon, skinwalker, wendigo, or unknown creature? I heard all of the legends regarding the woods at night. Don't look up in the trees. Don't respond if your mother calls your name. But everyone I have told this to tells me it was most likely a scared bobcat, or that they never heard of anything else before. So if anyone makes it this far and has some answers, I would greatly appreciate any answers. This happened directly to me. At the time of this story, I was a 12-year-old male who lived in California. For a summer trip, me and my family flew to Idaho for a week to stay with my cousins. We stayed at their house for 2 days, then came the best part, until what happened, that is. On the 3rd day, we drove to a small city in the Rocky Mountains of central Idaho. They owned a cabin. The first day was fishing at nearby lakes, playing games, and meeting a few of the neighbors on the small street. Everyone we met was nice. It was amazing. I thought nothing could go wrong. Let me stop here, and before I say more, here's a layout of the area. The room where I slept was at the back of the house. There was no fence at the back of the backyard because it was on the bank of a freezing cold river. Directly on the other side of the river was a huge mountain covered by a thick forest of pine trees. A small path starts on the other side of the river, but there's no bridge. But there is a bridge, a quarter of a mile down the road, in front of our house. I went to bed that night, and I woke up around 2 in the morning, needing to use the bathroom. I got up and did my thing, then headed back to my room. As I got into bed, I felt hot, so I opened my window. Not even 15 minutes after I opened my window, I heard the most terrifying screech come from the forest. It was raspy, but a high-pitched voice. I know for a fact it wasn't human. I heard plenty of stories from YouTube channels that often describe creatures that make weird noises that sound sort of human, but aren't. I heard it once more, but this time, closer. I eventually fell asleep after not hearing it for a while again. In the morning when I woke up, we explored the town. At around 7 p.m., me and my sister and my cousins got permission from our parents to go explore the forest. I felt uneasy, considering the creepy human-like noises in the night that I was hearing. The oldest cousin, Alex, who was 16, took a loaded pistol, a lighter, and backpack of snacks. I carry a hunting knife and a flashlight. The cousin my age, Julia, took just a flashlight. My sister Brianna and the other cousin Karina, who were both 10, took some extra batteries and a small bag of candy each. We made our way across the bridge at the end of the street and back to the path on the side of the river across from the house. All of us began the hike to the top of the mountain. We made it to the top of the mountain in an hour and a half. The view from 9,000 feet was incredible. We then stayed a little bit longer up there, and at 8:55, Alex and I figured it was time to head down, and we ordered the group to the path. At this time, it was dark now, and the sun had fully set. Julia and I turned on our flashlights and shined them ahead as we walked. When we were halfway down the mountain, which was about 45 minutes into the walk, I got this dreadful feeling you get when you're being watched and followed. Seconds later, I heard something coming from the bushes, a few yards into the side of the path that we were walking on. I brushed it off as some type of small animal, and about 5 minutes after this, we heard a noise, and it gripped me with fear, and my heart dropped to my stomach. It was that same horrifying screech from last night, echoing through the forest from a mile or 2 away. I told everyone we needed to move faster, and we did. The noise went off again, but closer, and again, and closer. Whatever that thing was, it was moving faster than us. We were full on speed walking by then, but it still wasn't fast enough because soon the screeching stopped, and we heard loud steps 30 yards off to the right. I got that feeling that I was being watched again. Alex took his gun and fired 2 shots in the general direction of the steps. The creature backed off, but even though we thought it was gone, I still sensed we were being watched. As the river came into sight, it caught me and everyone else by surprise. I heard the path of gravel crunching behind us. As I looked back into the darkness, I saw the outline of something that resembled a human. I told Alex, and his face went pale when he looked. We told the rest of the group quietly, and on 3, we all broke out into a run towards the river. Whatever that thing was, it was extremely fast. When we reached the river, we figured there wasn't enough time to get to the bridge, which was still a quarter of a mile further along the side of the river. So we jumped in and swam across the ice-cold water. This thing got to the river just as we made it up to the bank and into the backyard. Julia and I shined our flashlights and finally got a good look at it. It was a massive, hairy creature that was about 7 feet tall. It had huge, razor-sharp claws like a bear. Its eyes glowed red when the flashlight shined on them. Alex then took a shot at it, and it darted off within one final screech. We all looked at each other scared. Alex then explained everything to our parents. They didn't know what to make of it and had never heard of anything like it. I'm thankful that nothing happened to us, and also that I had noticed the creature behind us. If I hadn't, one of the others might not have noticed it until it was too late. The next time I stay at that cabin, I'm never going into those woods again. This story comes from Gallup, New Mexico. Family members are inside their home and getting ready for bed. All of a sudden, the dogs outside start raising a ruckus. The man of the family, including an uncle and some nephews, go outside to investigate, concerned about coyotes getting into the hen house. They think they see something moving about within the trees to the back of the house. The uncle picks up a handful of rocks and throws one after another into the trees. However, they hear or see nothing further outside of the ordinary, and so they end up returning to the house. With everything normal, the night is quiet and the dogs have stopped barking. They decide it's safe to go into bed. Just then, they hear a loud rustle from the trees, from the limbs whipping and branches snapping. They rush back out to the yard. All is quiet again. For 30 minutes or so, they stand guard, but not even the wind is blowing. The next morning, they go back outside and see that the gate to the hen house, as well as the door, is wide open. All of the birds are gone. The man ends up searching the yard, and out by the outhouse, they discover, instead, an odd set of tracks going back and forth, as if something upon 2 feet was pacing between there and the trees. Finding no signs of the chickens, they return to the area around the hen house to look for similar tracks, knowing that only one person or someone similar could have opened the gate and the door. But the only marks they find are within the pen, and they all belong to chickens. The grandmother, who is standing at the back door of the house, tells them that it was a skinwalker. She says a prayer, and together they yell in a loud voice and in Navajo, "Go away, go bother someone else." It all started when summer came, and me and my 3 friends, Leah, Kathy, and Jennifer, were all planning to go camping. Leah asked her dad if he could drop us off, and he agreed. When the next day came, we started heading up. Leah's dad had set up the camper that we were using. He told us there were some spare blankets inside, in case we got cold. Leah's dad finally got into his truck and turned around. He stopped and rolled down his window and said, "No boys," to all of us. He then gave us a smile to let us know he was joking with us, and drove off. There was 3 rooms, 1 master bedroom, and 2 rooms with bunks. Each room had a TV in it, so nobody cared what room they got. Everyone knew that Jennifer didn't like small rooms, so we ended up letting her have the big room. I was in the room with Leah, and Kathy was in a room by herself. I started unpacking when we heard a loud noise outside. "Leah, Did you hear that?" "Hear what? That noise?" We both looked at each other, startled, and then continued unpacking. But something seemed off. It was the fact that Leah was so chill about it. I was done unpacking, so I walked outside and started a fire. Jennifer walked out, and then she asked if I saw it. I responded with, "Saw what?" That's when she started freaking me out. She then started staring at me, but behind me, panicking. Her eyes darted back and forth, and then she was calm. I felt as if something was watching me, so I turned around, and I saw an orb in the corner of my eye, reddish, black, but by the time I turned around to fully look, it was gone. I was so freaked out, because we were in the middle of nowhere, you can say, and it was only the three of us, by ourselves. I then told Kathy that she could cook instead. We had her family's secret recipe of shepherd's pie, and a bunch of vanilla cupcakes. There were about a dozen cupcakes left in the open box, so we just left it on the table and went to bed. I could hear the TV coming from Kathy's room, so I punched the wall and told her to be quiet. Right after I said it, everything went quiet. But then, there was a small scream in the distance. It didn't sound human. It gave me chills that ran down my spine. But I ended up dozing off. But then, I woke up in the middle of the night, hearing noises, like if someone was in the kitchen. I wake up Leah, and then we walk out into the small hallway that led into the kitchen. We saw Jennifer sitting on the table, just staring straight ahead, with Kathy being right behind me. We were looking at her, and Jennifer was making weird noises, weird sounds. She was really creeping us out. She never did this or stared into space this often. But then I noticed something in the corner of my eye. It was a shadow. It was staring at Jennifer, and then it slowly turned to face me and Kathy. I froze. Kathy froze. Then Jennifer looked at us, as if she was being mind controlled. And then this figure, or shadow, ran out the window, and Jennifer dropped her head into the table. We were trying to wake her up afterwards, but she wouldn't wake up. This experience still scares me to this day, and it is only one of the creepiest things I have ever seen. Me and the others are still very close friends. We even live together now. But we all remember that night and whatever it was that we saw. It turns out that Jennifer remembers seeing it in the daytime, but she says she doesn't remember anything when nighttime came and when we saw it. It freaks us out even more now, knowing that our friend wasn't even awake and staring into space with her eyes wide open. So I want to first say that I don't know much about skinwalkers and other creatures of similar nature. I just now started learning of their potential existence. So now I'm willing to learn and be educated even more on these topics, especially ever since I came across something at night. There's this park my girlfriend and we used to go to smoke there a lot, and we encountered this same dog-like thing multiple times, and it was always at night. It looked like a really huge black dog with round bear-like ears and yellowish eyes. The first few times we saw it, we didn't think much of it, but then we noticed that it kept just like spawning in. It never made a sound, and it always just stared at us, and it would follow us around the park in a creepy way. And just an FYI, we encountered this dog while we were high and while sober on many different occasions. Anyways, We ended up not going to that park no more. But before we stopped going, one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me happened at that park. We were walking from the parking lot to the park, and we would just see this thing emerge from behind a tree and follow us and try to block our path back to the car. Sometimes we had to run and jump a fence just to get away from it. We never had a single dangerous interaction outside of this one time we were at the deepest corner of the park that was bordering a small forest, and we had to jump about 2 fences to avoid that thing. I do have a theory. It could be a stray, but it really did not act like a dog at all. It didn't even feel alive. I felt like it was just actually watching us for some reason, but it was really eerie. I was camping with some friends on a private-owned land that bordered a national forest. We had our tent set up at the back of the fence, clear part of their property. The large mesh window of my tent was facing out towards the forest. As evening came and we fell asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling as if somebody was up and about. You know that feeling of somebody watching you? Well, I was looking out the window and saw a dark from head to toe, human-shaped figure lean away from a tree and slowly lean back behind the tree. It kept doing it for a few minutes, as if it was checking out our camp. That's when I woke my girlfriend up and told her I thought someone was out in the forest behind us. But when she looked, she only saw a glimpse of a dark figure running off deeper into the forest. Nobody else from our camp had been outside of their tent. There were no neighbors anywhere close, and the closest campgrounds and hiking trails were also pretty far away. When I told this to everybody else within the camp, they said that I most likely saw a bear scratching its back on the tree. Apparently, they do this a lot, and sometimes they almost look humanoid. I'm not entirely satisfied that it was a bear, because the way it looked was just giving me a creepy feeling, as if something else, aside from a bear, was out there. We don't know what's out there in the woods sometimes, as it's full of darkness and voids, but I guess that's what makes camping fun and exciting, being in the middle of nowhere, of unknown territories, being surrounded by possibly humanoid bears, skinwalkers, wendigos, or anything else that lurks out there in the darkness. I was riding the ski lift with a U.S. Army veteran last week, and we got to talking when he mentioned that he spent the last couple of years living in the South Dakota Badlands. I asked if he had seen any Sasquatches out there, based off of my friend's South Dakota Sasquatch encounter. He said he hadn't, even though he was tracking bison and coyotes through the region at the time to better understand their hunting patterns. He did, however, relay a story in which he truly felt he had a close call with a Wendigo, in Kansas of all places. There's an old native Union Army trail that goes through Kansas, and my new friend, as well as my buddy of his, were hiking along the trail, enjoying the annual bird migration there, when all of a sudden, everything went deathly quiet. That's when he started hearing the sound of a woman screaming bloody murder. And even though his companion somehow couldn't hear it, the sound all throughout the hills. I think my buddy thought I was losing it, he said, but we both heard it go super quiet, which was odd in and of itself, as we were smack dab in the middle of a massive bird migration route. The Kickapoo live in the area presently, as a reservation was granted to the tribe back in 1832, and even though it was progressively reduced over the years, part of the tribe has continued to live down there in the present time. He said he had never been more sure that someone or something was trying to lure him out into the dense brush to kill him. What was odd though was that his friend couldn't seem to hear the screaming, even though it was crystal clear to his ears. I then asked if he had happened to see the creature or pinpoint the location of the screaming. Not exactly, he said, but I continue hearing weird sounds and noises, and when we camped out that night, that's when things got really bizarre. We hadn't seen a single soul for at least 2 days, and that night I was on high alert, so I had a tough time falling asleep. Every little sound had me poking out of my bivy sack with a 1911 style .45 pistol and scanning the area for any signs of movement. What was really creepy was at one point he said he thought he saw a tall dark shadow move from behind a tree to another, and possibly what might have been a hand reaching out around the tree before slowly retreating back into the stillness of the night. When he finally did fall asleep, his dreams were plagued by nightmares of him trying to escape some unseen assailant while running wildly through the brush, cutting his face and arms against the bramble. He had finally made it back to safety in the dream, at which point the dream would simply start over again, as if on repeat. This happened for what felt like ages, before he had woken up in a cold sweat and gone back to scanning around the perimeter. When at last, dawn finally broke and the sun gradually began to rise, they packed up their little camp and didn't have any more run-ins with this thing, even though the experience had left them shook. In her book, American Monsters, Linda Godfrey states that the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes in Kansas believe that there is an evil, man-eating giant human who was turned into this terrifying beast due to some sins. The Chippewa believe that selfishness, gluttony, or cannibalism would turn a tribe member into the Wendigo for punishment. Descriptions vary from tribe to tribe, but most describe a large elk-like predator that preys on people who wander too far off into its domain. Many report hearing sounds such as a baby crying, a woman screaming, or a voice playing on a static loop of sorts. Perhaps a phrase the beast somehow recorded from previous victims. Typically, something to the effect of, "Who's there? I need help. I'm lost. Is someone there? Please, help me. I'm hurt." The idea being that basic human instinct will lead one off into the wilderness, attempting to help whomever they think is needing assistance. Another common theme is hearing the voice of a loved one, maybe your mother, drawing you into the woods, or even a familiar form, appearing in the mist, followed by the gradual realization that the voice is off, or that the form doesn't quite fit the supposed dimensions of a human being, often too tall or too slender, with arms that are too long, and a stance more suited for a wild animal than a human person. All these possibilities we discussed, while also discussing other native folklore such as deer woman or shape-shifting witches, all of which are relatively common motifs in the mythology of the region. What do you think it was? I told him about your channel and I sent him a couple of links. I'm sure he would like to hear your thoughts. I grew up in Winslow, Arizona, but also lived for a period of time on the reservation near the Puerco River. My grandparents have a home which is more to the east, and not all that far from the New Mexico state line. When my mother and aunts were children, they lived further west. Their house was in a wooded area, and though there were neighbors, there wasn't that many. When I was young, I often heard stories of skinwalkers, but never really believed until I got older, and after my grandmother, a Christian woman, not prone to superstition or telling lies, shared with me and my cousins an encounter that occurred when my mother and her sisters, my aunts, were still small children. They were living at the time in a 3-bedroom house, full wood construction, surrounded by a small fence, and with chicken wire around the front porch. One night, when all the children are in bed, and my grandfather is off working, she is awakened by a noise that she hears outside. She gets up out of bed, and in the dark, makes her way out to the living room. It is then that she hears something up on the roof of the house. She said that she knows immediately what it is. Her first instinct is to go out to the front porch and curse the creature that has picked her and her family as a target. As she makes her way to the front door, she hears it walking around over her head. Then, as soon as she starts to open the door to go out, she hears it jump down by the side of the porch, open the porch door, come up to the steps, and right up to the kitchen window, only about 10 feet away from where my grandmother is standing. She says that she is really scared now, but as the porch light is on, she thinks that she can take a peek through the window and see what is out there. Just as she starts to pull aside the curtain, her whole body freezes, as if she has no control over it whatsoever. However, she can hear just fine, and whatever is out there on the porch starts to scratch at the kitchen window, as if it's trying to get into the house. My grandmother says she starts praying and asking God to make whatever it is go away. And this is before she becomes a Christian. Finally, the creature gives up and leaves. Once it is gone, my grandmother is able to move again. She says she knows it was a skinwalker. Her own mother had often shouted into the night, and her father would shoot with a shotgun into the darkness whenever a skinwalker came around their whole gun. The next morning, when my grandfather comes home from work, she tells him what happened. He takes the ladder and goes up into the roof and discovers a bundle of dry grass and twigs placed there alongside of the chimney. He tells her that the skinwalker might have wanted to start a fire in order to get her and the girls out of the house. Later that day, one of the older men from the reservation comes by the house and puts ash over the doorway. Even to this day, my grandmother swears that she knows who that skinwalker was. But what's more weird, or strange, is that she's never told us. And even now, she won't say who it was. In Arizona, there is an older woman who lives not far from my grandmother's house. She works about halfway to Gallup, New Mexico, maybe about 20 minutes away from my grandmother's house. On cold mornings, she gets up before the sun to start her car and let it warm up before she makes the drive. Her house is surrounded by a dark wood fence, which is about 5 feet tall. This one morning, as she is making her way out to the car, she hears voices that seem to be chanting and giggling. She thinks they are coming from over by this low hill to the east of her house and back from the road. She walks over to the fence and takes a look, but it's still dark and the hill is covered with trees and bushes. She doesn't see anything or anyone, and the voices have stopped. She doesn't give it another thought, goes about her usual morning routine, and eventually leaves for work. A few nights later, she is bringing in her laundry from the outside line when she hears really loud music coming from the neighbor's yard across the street. She decides to be nosy and walks over to the fence to see which one of the boys it is, thinking that maybe she can ask him to lower the volume some. Just as she gets to the fence, she sees a dark figure step from the trees on that low hill and make its way down towards the street. It's moving kind of funny, as if it's not accustomed to its own body. She screams, and it starts to run really fast towards the young man playing the boombox. He must have heard her, because she says he lowered the volume. However, when she turns back around to see where the figure has gone to, it's now gone. She says that she was certain that it was a skinwalker. There's an old crow story dating back to the turn of the 20th century about a man and his daughter driving their wagon along one of the back dirt roads of the reservation. They're on their way to the market. The daughter, about 10 years of age, notices an old woman up ahead. She is limping along the middle of the road and mumbling to herself. Just then, her father moves the horse pulling the wagon, and it breaks into a faster pace, trolling up alongside the old woman. As soon as the father is in reach, he raises his buggy whip and trashes the woman across the back. Then and there, right before the eyes of the little girl, the old woman withers down in size, turns into a coyote, and runs off into the trees by the roadside. Her father, not in the least bit surprised, turns to her and says, "Let that be a lesson to you." The canyons throughout the Four Corners, for those who don't know, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, Nevada fits in there too, are populated with signs and indications of the presence of the ancestors of the tribes native to the area. Most common are petrographs and petroglyphs, drawings on stones, the remains of cliff dwellings, and ancient roads which seem to run to nowhere. There are also man-made structures of stone houses and temples. Most of these areas are accessible to visitors. However, they are also monitored by local and tribal authorities, which protect them and ensure their preservation. That being said, it is not uncommon to find graffiti and other evidence of disregard for these historical sites. Several years ago, a friend of mine, a local Hopi guide for the tourists, and I are poking around these ruins. It's already dark, but if you are going to go to these places for the reason we go, see if there's anything of value that hasn't yet been recovered. You have to go at a time you're likely not to be seen. I have gone to other similar places with this guy, and we had some luck with small relics that tourists will buy. By the way, I am Hopi as well. We are only there for a short period when we hear something moving towards the ridge and only a few yards from where we are. My friend takes a pistol from his waist and points it over to the trees. He's calling out in our native language some words we both know and which are generally used to ward off dark spirits. By the sound of things, whatever is out there is getting more bold and coming closer, but we still can't see anything. At the same time, there is this feeling of dread building up inside of me, and I'm thinking too how nice it would be to have a pistol instead of the flashlight that I am carrying. At this time, we're both thinking Skinwalker. But that's just part of who we are as Hopi. My friend then starts backing the two of us towards the edge, running up and over our heads. Just then, this sharp, yipping sound breaks out, followed by this sustained high-pitched scream, which slices right through me like an icy wind. I find myself praying before I realize I am doing it already. My friend is starting to chant in Hopi, his voice filled with fear. We both have no doubt it is a skinwalker, and it is coming right at us. I lift my flashlight and point its bright beam in the direction of that blood-chilling screech. The skinwalker, still in the dark, responds by making this throat mucus-filled sound, a sort of coughing noise. I am waving the light all around trying to get a glimpse of it. Just then, I guess my friend can't take it anymore and starts firing his pistol, the rounds tearing through the bushes. I drop for cover and duck my head, saying the Hail Mary the whole time. When he stops firing, I look up in time to see this dark shape run up the sheer slope of the ridge, just to the other side of the trees and brush. We didn't hang around to see where it went, leaving the ruins behind and getting back to our truck. So if you ever go anywhere near the Four Corners, don't stay past nighttime. And whatever you do, don't venture out into any native, man-made structures, temples, or anything related to ancient native tribes. You might just come across a skinwalker. I myself am not Navajo, but my friend is. He grew up around Gallup, New Mexico. He loves to tell me stories about skinwalkers. He knows it gives me the chills. According to him, they are not like werewolves, but are dark spirits that use the skins or even the flesh of anything living that may serve its purpose. They will also use animal parts as totems. For example, they will take the claws from a bear or the antlers from a deer. They are known to come after humans too, but he says that's a native thing and that white people have nothing to worry about. He says the only way to make it stop bothering you is to take away its disguise. The scariest story he tells is about this Navajo trucker that his father knows. Every night he makes the long run to the reservation from Gallup. One night, when halfway there, he hears a loud noise against the front passenger side of his truck. Thinking he might have hit something, he pulls off to the shoulder of the road to take a look, but he finds nothing, not even a mark or dent on the fender. So he gets back on the road and resumes driving. But only a few seconds later, he sees something in his rear view mirror towards the middle of the road and moving up on him. And it's not another vehicle. Then, just as suddenly as it appears, it's gone. Shrugging it off, he goes back to paying attention to the road, with his semi going about 60 miles per hour. He chances to look in his mirror, and again, he sees this thing chasing him, and it is moving fast. Just like that, it's at his driver's door, and holding onto the handle and striding along. Then, without warning, it turns to him with its dog-like face and dull, dark eyes, and smashes in the window. The driver slams on the brakes. The cab of the truck goes into a slide, the trailer jackknifing past him. The whole time, this creature is holding on to the door and reaching in through the broken window trying to grab him. Somehow, the truck comes to a stop, blocking both lanes of the road straight across. The driver is so scared, he doesn't even notice the creature is gone, and instead throws the door open and runs off into the desert. Now, he must have passed out or something, because he awakes with the sun coming up and finds himself huddled by this rock formation. He's dusty, a little dirty, and missing his shirt, but is otherwise unharmed. Sitting there getting his bearings, the events of the previous night come back to him. He gets up to his feet, dusts himself off, and walks out back to the highway, not knowing what to expect with his truck. However, as he reaches the road, he sees it parked as neat as it can be there on the shoulder. When he gets up to it, he sees there's nothing wrong with the driver's door window. It's as if he imagined the whole thing. He does notice, however, a series of small scratches on the driver's door all around the handle, as if something was clawing at it. These marks were not there previously. I grew up in the woods. I was raised by a single foster parent. Margie and she was too busy to bother with me. So instead of hanging with my foster siblings, I went into the woods. By the time I could drive, I was spending more time in the woods than I was at home. In all seriousness, I don't think I slept at home one night my senior year. There was something about being in the forest that made me feel at peace. Something that kept Margie's shit parenting at bay. Over those years, I learned nearly everything about the forest that a kid my age could. Foxes sound like people, cougars are perfect hunters, bears can climb trees, and the most important thing, if the forest goes silent, something is wrong. If you're gonna take anything away from the story, I pray that you make it that. Silence is not good when you're deep in the forest. Like anyone in my situation would, I moved away from home as soon as I could. I packed up my room, loaded up my truck, and found a nice outdoors town by a state over. I was beyond excited when I saw an ad in the newspaper about some trapping gear that someone wanted to sell. Trapping and hunting were some of the better jobs I could work as they paid well, and being born native meant that I could apply for a year-round hunting permit. Plus, it would give me an excuse to live up in the woods and only leave every once in a while. With that idea in mind, I called the owner of the gear, his name was Clark, and asked what he was selling and what it might cost. He told me that the set contained 8 different traps, an animal call box, snares, knives, and a Winchester 1200. He was selling everything for $2,500. I had saved up money that I had made, or that was gifted to me, and being young and dumb, I bought everything. Within a week of buying the gear, I bought my permit, and the state I'm in requires a separate trapping license, so I got that one too. All that set me back another $400, but I was finally ready to live like I wanted to. Clark said that there was a hunting lodge I could stay at. No one owned it, so it was free to stay. People would repair it when it needed to be fixed, and that was about it. From that point on, I became a woodsman, and I lived like that for a few years, spending more time in the woods than in my own apartment. Trapping had actually made me a good amount of money, and when furs and pelts weren't doing too well, the meat and the claws sold well too. I had become accustomed to the noises from the woods, animal calls, god-awful noises, wind blowing through the top layers of the trees. All those sounds became ingrained in me. So now, I guess I'll tell you all why I'm actually writing this. Last weekend, I went up to the lodge to settle in. There was no one at the lodge when I got there, which is pretty normal for midsummer. I'm the only native that hunts up here, so I'm the only one that stays here all year. Aside from a single backpack on one of the beds, the lodge was barren. I set my gear down, grabbed a can of soup, and headed to the kitchen to make myself something to eat. As I walked past one of the windows, I saw something along the edge of the trees. The lodge was in the middle of a circular break in the forest, so the area around the lodge was just open. No canopy, no trees, just grass and ferns. On the edge of the tree line was something. It was a little too dark under the shade of the trees to really make out what it was, but something was definitely there. I tried to study the figure, looking for a shape or some color, but it was too hidden, and I came up empty. Eventually, the figure faded out of sight, walking into the deeper part of the woods. As the sun started to go down, the watercolor sky changed from a light blue to a deep purple, before fading out into blackness. I took out some of the snares, grabbed my shotgun, and walked out of the lodge. I like to set the snares at night, that way the animals trip them when they wake up to look for food. It just makes more sense. Clicking on the barrel-mounted flashlight, I stepped outside. Something instantly felt wrong, almost like if I was somewhere new. I had walked the woods at night hundreds of times, but they felt unfamiliar now. The wind blew far above the treetops, adding an almost musical sound to the surrounding area. After I got a few snares set up, I decided that I would finish the others once the sun came up, and I started walking back to the trail leading to the lodge. On the way, just before I broke the tree line next to the trail, I saw someone walking on the path, just out of the reach of my flashlight. He didn't seem to have any gear, and he must have been walking by the light of the moon, as I didn't see the beam from a flashlight. Feeling like a bit of a trickster, I clicked my light on and made my way silently back onto the trail. My plan was to sneak up on the guy and scare him. Seeing as he didn't have a gun, I figured I wouldn't get my head blown off. He was pretty far ahead of me, so I tried to walk a little bit faster, but he made it over one of the hills on the trail and left my line of sight. Expecting him to pop back up on the other side any second, I hustled a little bit to close the gap. When I got closer to the hill, a shriek ripped through the nearby woods. I heard every animal in those woods make every noise they could, and I still have no idea what could have let that scream out. It sounded like the call of some ancient, terrible beast, a creature that was far more intelligent than anything else in the woods. I switched my light back on and called out for the man I saw earlier, but he was nowhere to be found. Part of me was hoping he took off running towards the lodge, but every ounce of me knew that I couldn't wait around to check. So I bolted back up the trail, and that's when the horrible noise came tearing through the woods again. That's when it hit me. Apart from the noises and my footfalls, the forest was silent. No birds, no small animals, even all the wind had gone away. There was absolutely no noise. My boots stamped against the dirt, kicking up dust and rocks as I tore up the path trying to run. I've been hunted by cougars, bears, wolves, but this time, something felt different. I still felt like something was watching me, burning its eyes in me as I ran. Only instead of it watching out of a territorial need or a need for food, was actually playing with me, like it was allowing me to keep going, like it was waiting for me to catch some air. By the time the lodge came into view, another noise, another shriek. This time, it sounded much closer. I pushed the door open, and when I spun around to slam the door shut, I saw the same man from earlier. He seemed very calm, and he stopped just as he broke through the tree line. Nothing about him seemed normal. How did he end up behind me? I had been looking ahead the whole time, and I never passed him. Apparently, he was right on my heels too. At least if he was that close when I got to the cabin. But I didn't hear him behind me. When he started to walk, I slammed the door shut and locked it. Whatever he wasn't getting in here. Using my flashlight, I went around and turned all the lights in the lodge on, and then checked all the windows and entrances. Once the place was secured, I sat down on a bed and tried to sleep it off, thinking that the sun would force whatever I heard to retreat. Within seconds of snoozing, I was woken up by the sound of banging on a window. The grogginess of my sleep was wearing off as I neared the source of the banging. From afar, I could make out a vague, white shape in the window. The longer I stared, the more clear it became. It was the exact same guy from earlier, face pressed against the glass, with his hand banging on the window. Hoping that I could just walk up and ask what he wanted, I started to walk ahead, slowly. When I got within an arm's length of the window, the man stopped slamming his hand into the window, and instead, his jaw dropped. At first it stayed at a normal distance, but after a while, his jaw began to crack, and it descended even further down. His mouth was hanging open, and I noticed the sound, quiet at first, coming from his throat. It was a low, deep groan. After a few seconds of groaning, a voice came from him.
Open window.
That's all he said. Nothing more, nothing less. He was just repeating that line over and over.
Open window. Open window. Open window.
no emotion. I told him to fuck off, that I wasn't gonna die because he wanted to come in. When he didn't back off, I turned and grabbed my shotgun, walked back up, and placed the barrel against the window.
Open window. Open window.
He began to shake like he was having a violent seizure, twitching, maybe from the cold, maybe from something else. That's when the same piercing shriek from earlier came out of the dark hole that was his throat, and he slipped away in the darkness, leaving the window. I was able to get a little bit of sleep that night, but I was briefly awoken a few times by more noises and more shrieks. When the sun had started to creep up through the sky the next morning, I checked all the windows and then deemed it safe enough to go outside. Circling the lodge, I noticed a few things. Footprints leading from the same window that this man or thing was at, back to the forest. And on the other side of the same window were deep scratches. Other than that, the surrounding area was normal. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was feeling safe enough to be able to walk down to the trail and to my truck. So I grabbed my gear and noticed that the same backpack was still there. It had been there since I got to the lodge, and I figured that someone might have left it up there and forgot about it. I figured I would grab it and leave an ad in the paper about it. I loaded up the backpack and left the lodge, not even bothering to check on the snares. The trail seemed longer than it had ever been before, and the hiking down felt uneasy, but it wasn't until I got within sight of my truck that I really lost it. Just as I came to the part where the trail opens up, I decided to take one last look into the woods, and behind a fallen tree, I saw him. The same man from earlier, standing there, watching me. I tossed my gear in the back, jumped in the truck and drove off. As I sped down the road back to town, I noticed something in the woods alongside the car, just ahead of me. Looking outwards towards the road was the same man, but something about him looked different. His arms seemed to hang down to his knees, and his face looked more sunken. Fearing that he would find a way into the car, I floored the gas and hoped there wouldn't be any state troopers out. I got back to town and headed home. I needed to rest, and a few days later, I decided to head to City Hall and turn in the backpack and warn someone about what I had seen. Before I even got to the permit section of the building, I was stopped by the lady at the front desk. She asked me if I'd been out by the lodge, and I told her yes. She asked me to wait in the lobby, and I agreed. After a few minutes, the sheriff showed up and asked to talk with me. Apparently a day or two before I went into the woods, there had been an animal attack. A hiking group of 3 people. One died, one was missing, and the one that made it back, really bad. The sheriff wanted to know if I saw any strange animal activities, and I told him what happened. Instead of disbelief and a laugh, he asked me to take a look at a picture and see if I recognized it. When he took the picture out of his pocket, I almost had a panic attack. It was the same man I had seen in the forest. It looked like a driver's license photo or something. The sheriff wasn't surprised when I told him that was the same man. He actually thanked me and left the building. I wanted to just forget about everything, like it never happened, to go on with my life and keep living how I'm used to. But there's one issue. Sometimes, when I look out my window at night, I swear I see the same man. But now, his arms are far longer than any human arm, and his jaw still hangs loose and open. I think it followed me from the trail, and I'm not sure what to do. When I was 8 years old, Both of my parents worked full-time. My dad was on third shift at his job, and my mom was a school teacher. We lived right up the road from my grandparents in a very small town. It was getting close to my 9th birthday when I got strep throat and scarlet fever. I ended up severely sick. I could barely speak, had the first case of cold sweats that I remember in my life, and could barely pull myself out of bed to even use the restroom. My poor mother was at a loss of what to do with her working, and my dad needing to use daylight hours to sleep. The first day I was sick, my dad stayed up most of the day with me, made me food, wiped my forehead down, made sure I took my medicine, and everything else. But on the second day, my grandmother had called and offered to let me stay at her house so my dad could sleep. He said yes and woke me up around 7 that morning to drive me up to her place. My grandfather also worked at this time as well, so he was already gone to work when I got there. I don't remember too much of the early morning. I must have just slept in my grandmother's bed, tossing and turning, when I would wake up feeling extra bad. She encouraged me to swallow my awful tasting medicine a little more gently than my dad did at least. She did fix me some tomato soup to try to eat, and it was the first time since I got sick that I had an appetite. I should mention that my grandmother had this little small dog named Samson. Samson came into the room and curled up next to me as I dozed off. I do know when I woke up at some point, it had to be the early afternoon lunchtime, because I could hear the TV from the living room on some game show. My grandmother had a ritual of eating her lunch while watching a game show. I think it was The Price is Right. I was trying to fall back asleep because I got this really bad headache coming, maybe from dehydration. I was on the edge of falling asleep when I suddenly woke up by "Samson!" scream that erupted from the living room. The dog curled up next to my feet, perked up, but didn't move. I knew I heard his name being called, but it was strange. He didn't respond. "Samson!" my grandma called again. "Samson!" The dog still didn't run out of the room to her. I was confused, as he was obedient to my grandmother. He was almost frozen, staring at the cracked open door, but making no attempt to go to her. She called again, "Samson!" maybe 3 or 4 more times. "Samson! Samson! Samson!" Then, I actually got annoyed. I remember flinging the covers off of me. Of course, all of my clothes is sticky with sweat, and I just feel uncomfortable and groggy. I stumble out of the room, wiping my eyes and asking, "Grandma, do you need Samson? He's in your room with me. I'm in the living room and I have to do a double take. The TV is still on and loud. There's a bowl of soup sitting on the coffee table, and also an open Pepsi next to it. But my grandmother isn't anywhere in the room. Maybe she's in the bathroom." I crossed the room and went past the kitchen, but it was empty too. I got to the bathroom door, which was shut. Nothing. I then opened it. No one was in there. The house is empty. It's not a huge house either. I went by through every single room. So yeah, my first reaction was to get scared. I could clearly hear my grandmother calling for the dog, but she's not anywhere inside. I can feel my hands and feet get all tingly. I start shouting for my grandma, but my voice is just echoing through the small cramped home. Samson had gotten up at this point and was sitting near the couch, looking completely undisturbed. I fumbled for the remote and turned the TV off, and yelled to the top of my lungs, which you can imagine how painful this was with a scratchy, infected throat. "Grandma!" The worst part happened next. That's when I heard my grandma shouting my name back, clear as ever, like she was standing only feet away. I start crying now, scared out of my mind. I feel like maybe it has to be a ghost. I grew up with scary ghost stories courtesy of my dad, and I'm convinced now that I'm in the room with a ghost. And then she, whatever this was, proceeded to call my name again. Then there was a second voice. Definitely not my grandmother's. It was deeper, definitely more masculine and terrifying, as it said,
"Come to the front door."
Of course I didn't go. Instead, I made sure to run back to my grandparents' bedroom, lock the door, and pick up the telephone on their nightstand. I called my own home phone and my dad's sleepy voice answered. Through a barely comprehensible voice, I managed to croak something like, "Dad, there's someone in the house and I can't find Grandma. She's gone." My dad of course said he jumped out of bed, grabbed his army knife he kept in a drawer next to the bed, and ran down the road to the house in his PJs and bare feet. He ran up to the front door, jiggled the handle. It was locked. So he made his way around, and since he knew the garage code, just punched it in and got inside. A quick sweep of the 3 rooms of the home showed no one was in there. It's not like there was really anywhere to hide. I ran out of the room once I was sure he was there, and began crying in his arms. He kept reassuring me that there was no one here, and then he asked if I knew where Grandma was at. I said I didn't, and explained that I woke up to her calling for Samson, but she hadn't been anywhere there. This was back when cell phones were definitely around, but there were no iPhones, and my grandparents weren't going to be buying them anyways. My dad had a cell phone, but he didn't have it on him at the time. I could tell he was trying to keep calm, so he just said we would need to go back to our house. I was sure he was going to call the police at that point, just because my grandma still hadn't popped up, and her vehicle was still in the driveway when he got in. If she had left, she must have gone on foot. We hadn't even made 2 steps out of the driveway when from my grandma's neighbor's house, my grandma was strolling out, talking to the neighbor. She then saw my dad, and then she saw me, crying my eyes out, and immediately ran over to see what was wrong. She was super apologetic. She said she had stepped out right when she had heated up her suit to go see her neighbor, who had called about looking at something that my grandma was gonna buy. My grandma figured I was asleep, and she thought she would only be gone for 10 or 15 minutes. At first, people may have assumed I was feverish, therefore confused, but I still stand by what happened. I know for a fact I was definitely alone in the house with Samson, but the voices I heard were real. For a while, I refused to go back to my grandma's house because this happened in the middle of the fucking day. I later read stories at school about wendigos, or the creatures that would disguise their voices to draw people. This was the best explanation I could ever form about what I heard. I never shared to anyone that I thought it was for sure a wendigo, and chalked it up to maybe just a ghost. I'm close to my 20s now. Last year was the first time I shared the story fully to my grandpa, who actually just used to say, "The fever you had must have made you had bad dreams." We were sitting on the front porch of the house, smoking cigarettes, and exchanging stories. When I finished telling him, for the first time he looked sort of disturbed about it. He finally put his cigarette out, and just stared out into the road. Then he cleared his throat, and looked over to me. "You know," he said slowly, "some funny things used to happen around that time, in the middle of the night. I would wake up to take a piss or something. When I would first sit up in the bed, I could hear your grandma sleeping away, snoring." He chuckled, but his face grew serious again. "Anyways, I would always hear her calling for the dog." I tried to remain looking calm, but my voice still shook when I asked, "Even when she was sleeping? Sleep talking?" No." He shook his head. "I listened. I actually heard her calling from outside. Maybe the living room. She would call for the dog. She would call my name. All while she was really sleeping next to me. Sleeping like a baby." "Well, have you ever told anyone?" "No, I don't want to scare her. She's real scared of ideas like ghosts. That's why when you were younger, and this thing happened, I told her just to remember you've been sick, fever and all. Most likely having nightmares." He looked gravely at me. Don't repeat this to her, please. She's really not the type to be scaring. I wanted to cry. I had this itchy, creepy feeling suddenly about being at the house. Hey Grandpa, do you still hear it sometimes? Of course, I still do. He was now reaching into his breast pocket to get out another cigarette. I hear him every night, but you just gotta remember not to do what it says. Even the dog figured this out. If it says come to the door, you stay away from the door. If it says come here, you just stay still in the room until it quits calling. And with that, he asked to borrow my lighter again. I have a story. It's not mine, but it happened to my uncle. He used to tell this story when we went camping, and it scared the lights out of me every time I heard it. We live in Utah, and my uncle Mark went on a mission at 19. They sent him to a native reservation in Arizona. They paired him up with a companion named Carl. When they first got there was a huge argument with the locals on the reservation about them going there. They didn't want my uncle and Carl staying on the res. Eventually, they came to a compromise that they would stay on the outskirts in a trailer. This reservation wasn't very big and was located next to a wooded area. The first night, they were trying to sleep when all of a sudden their trailer started to shake violently, back and forth. Startled and not sure what was happening, they climbed under the table for cover. Mark could hear someone pushing it from both sides of the trailer, like a group of people. And then, after about 5 minutes, it stopped. The next day, they made rounds on the res and were talking to the locals. Carl made a comment to one of the families that their trailer was shaking the night before. The family got very quiet and then told him they had to leave. They thought it was pretty strange, but didn't think much of it. The next night it happened again. They were awakened by the trailer shaking back and forth. Again, they climbed under the table until it stopped. This went on for 2 more nights. Anytime they tried to talk to anyone about it, they got quiet and told them they had to leave. Mark started thinking that because of their arrival, the locals were doing this to scare them off the res. They then went into a store and they were talking together about how frustrated they were with the situation. The clerk overheard and said, "They can't talk about it. It's forbidden." Confused, they asked, "Can't talk about what?" The guy continues to tell them about the Skinwalkers. He says they are evil demons that were once Native American witches. If they talk about it, the Skinwalkers will come for their souls. They just walked out of there baffled. They thought the clerk was just trying to scare them. So that night, when the shaking started again, my uncle decided to be brave and confront them. He went to the trailer door, flew it open, and yelled. When he did that, he saw 3 animals run off. 2 were a wolf, 1 was a bear. However, they looked strange, almost with human features. As he watched them run towards the trees, all 3 of them stood up on 2 legs and walked slowly towards the trees, making a human, cackling laugh. It scared him so bad that they called their mission president that next morning and asked to be moved. They were relocated that day, and for a year, nothing happened. One day, they announced that Carl was being relocated to another city, and Mark was getting a new companion named Jimmy. They had to drive for about an hour to pick Jimmy up from the airport. The road they traveled went through the boundaries of the res. They arrived at 8 p.m. and picked them up. The mission president tells Jimmy, "We're driving through a dangerous area at night, so we can't make any stops. If you need to use the restroom, you need to go now." Jimmy then says that he's fine. The mission president gets serious enough to even freak out Mark. "I'm not kidding. Go do your business." Jimmy was insistent he was fine, so they hit the road. As they were about 30 minutes into the drive, They were going through the area of the reservation boundaries. Jimmy starts complaining that he needed a pee so bad. The mission president says, "We can't stop here. You're gonna have to hold it." Jimmy keeps going on. "I seriously can't hold it anymore." So the mission president stops the car and says, "But you will do your business next to the door, and if I say get in the car, you need to get in the car fast." Jimmy was looking confused and said, "Alright." And then he opens the door and starts to do his business. About 5 seconds later, the mission president says nothing and just pulls Jimmy into the car and floors it. Jimmy and Mark start freaking out. "What's going on?" The mission president says nothing and just increases his speed. All of a sudden, Mark sees something next to the car to his right. A giant wolf-looking man was running on 2 feet next to the vehicle. Mark then looked over at the gauges. They were going over 60 miles an hour and still going faster. The wolf creature kept right next to the car for 10 minutes until it finally took off into the trees. Shaking, Jimmy gets out of the car when they arrive. They didn't speak after this whole situation. And then he says, "What did I just see?" The mission president says, "Next time I tell you to take care of your business, you need to take care of your business." I woke up yesterday morning very comfortable and restored from a full night's sleep. It was going to be a good day. I could tell. I heard the familiar sound of my mom fumbling around with her keys that she did every morning before she left for work. "See you after work," she yelled from the door. I was so comfy in bed, but couldn't get back to sleep because I slept so long last night. So I got up and just played video games for a while. Everything seemed normal that day. I let my dogs out and sat on my bed playing on my laptop. I got hungry like any teenager does and went to my kitchen to get some food. I walked into the kitchen and was shocked at what I saw. Every single cupboard door was open, and there was a row of bowls perfectly in line on the counter. I yelled for my dad, who I thought made this mess, but then I realized that he was at work too. I thought nothing of this and just put all the dishes back. It was about 4:30, normally the time my mom gets home, when my front door opened. I yelled down from my room, "Hey Mom," but I got no response. Normally she is always happy to be greeted by me, so I was confused. I ran down to see what was wrong, but nothing was there. Now, I was starting to get worried. Then I heard, "Hey Jake," from behind me. It was a monotone voice, nothing like my mom's. I turned around and my mom was there. Well, physically she was here. However, she just stood there staring at me, with her head cocked to the left ever so slightly. Her eyes were open wide, and her smile was huge. So I said, "Hey," in a puzzled tone, and she responded with, "Where is Dad?" in that same monotone voice. I responded, "He's at work, just like he is every day at this time." I was starting to get freaked out. "Very good," she said. Then she turned around and walked out the door. I was really scared at that moment. To make it worse, my phone started ringing. I picked it up, and it was my mom. "Hey honey, I'll be home soon. I got stuck in a meeting at work. What do you want for dinner?" I just dropped the phone and ran out the back door. Now I'm at my grandma's house with my mom, and we don't know what to do. It's like 5 a.m., and I have no intentions of sleeping. I'm not sure what came to my house earlier, but it really scared me. Why did that thing want to know where my dad was? I need to get all this sorted out, so I'll leave you off here for now. I'll update you all if I find out more about the situation. Every summer, when my sister and I were young, my dad would set up a tent in the backyard. I have fond memories of afternoons spent playing in our super secret clubhouse. To enter, visitors have to either recite the password or pay a reasonable entrance fee, 1 cookie per club member. The tent was ours, and ours alone, and we could leave it in a big mess as we wanted to, without getting scolded. Comics, toys, blankets, and even clothes were scattered about on the floor, but neither of us minded the chaos. On rare occasions, Dad would let us spend the night alone in the tent. Those nights were special to us, as they were the only times we got to do anything outdoors, you can say. We lived in the city, and the closest we got to nature was a small forest separating our yard from the neighbor's home. The trees were so thin and far apart from one another that we could clearly see through the other side. It barely even qualified as a forest, but despite this, I learned one night that something could hide in it, just out of sight. And that night was the last I ever spent in the tent. It happened when I was about 9 years old. I woke up one morning to the sound of my dad shutting the attic door. The noise could only mean one of two things. Either he wanted to go down memory lane and wanted to look at our family albums, or it was time for the tent to come up. I ran out into the hall, only to see him pulling the lumpy bag that contained our childhood fort. My dad smiled as I squealed and bounced with excitement. While my sister and I were eating breakfast, he slaved away in the backyard, pitching the old patchy tent onto the freshly cut grass. From time to time, we would hear him curse, but whenever we looked out the window, he would just smile and wave. He wanted to make us happy, so he would hide his frustrations as best as he could. In hindsight, he could have spared himself a lot of grief if he had taken the time to find the assembly instructions, but he always managed to figure it out on his own, eventually. We knew we were in for a special treat when my father disappeared in the garage, only to return with an extension cord and the small TV that used to belong to the kitchen counter. It had broken a few months back, but my dad had found a way to repair it. He ran the extension cord from the socket near the sliding glass patio door all the way into the tent, where he then plugged the TV. Upon his return, he said that my sister and I were going to have a special movie night. We were excited. That night, Dad brought us popcorn, candy, and some hot chocolate. He kissed us goodnight and left us to our marathon of Disney tapes. We fell asleep to the sound of crickets chirping outside and animals singing on screen. It must have been near midnight when I woke up, my bladder almost exploding from all the hot chocolate I had drunk earlier. It was quiet outside. If not for the sound of the static coming from the TV, I would have thought someone had swallowed all the outdoor noise. Just as I started to unzip my sleeping bag, the motion sensor porch light suddenly came to life, casting both bright rays and a strange shadow on the wall of the tent. "Dad?" I asked weakly, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. That's when I heard an unnatural shriek in response, unlike the call of an eagle, though the sound was lower and more drawn out. I examined the shadow. Its proportions were stretched and exaggerated, as though someone had made a semblance of a human out of pipe cleaners. As the distorted shape drew near, I fearfully reached a hand towards my sister, shaking her sleeping bag. She was tucked in all the way with only her dark matted hair sticking out from the top. She had always been a heavy sleeper, so when she fell to awaken, I wasn't surprised. Thumping sounds resonated on the porch as the figure moved. It began to circle around the tent. As terrifying as its shadow was, it was more terrifying to lose it from view every time it reached the back of the tent. Little by little, the stalker walked around circles around the tent, drawing even nearer with each rotation, until it was within arm's reach. Its fingertips, or what I assume were fingertips, crept along the fabric, producing a noise like paper being torn. Fortunately, it didn't seem capable of piercing the protective mesh. Suddenly, the TV jerked violently towards the tent's entrance. The thing was pulling on the extension cord. The zipper began to unravel as the power cord lifted against it. I dove towards the TV as swiftly as I could and unplugged it. There was so much tension on the cord that my actions caused the form to fall back with an angry shriek. This time, I heard my sister moving. I barely had time to process what happened. when I saw something slide into the tent from the small opening it had just made. Its texture was unlike anything I had ever seen, or have ever seen since then. I would say it was similar to a lizard's scales, only more porous. My instincts made me smash the TV against the finger, causing it to retract. Quickly, I pulled the zipper back down to the ground, only to feel the creature pulling it in the opposite direction. It wanted to get in, but I wasn't gonna let it. I may have been just a child, but I was stronger than I looked. In the midst of all my issues growing up that I had, my father once tried to lock me in a room. Despite the fact that a grown man was holding the door shut, I still managed to crack it open a few times by sheer force of uncontrolled will. Now, I was doing the same, but with a flimsy zipper instead. A snap resounded in the backyard, and once again, the creature fell and shrieked. I could only determine that the slider on its end had broken. Its ear-piercing noises made me quiver. I felt paralyzed, but I kept my hands firmly in place. My sister, on the other hand, merely turned over in her sleeping bag. As I sat there in fear, I heard the creature's footsteps head towards the woods, where they grew more distant. Even when the motion sensor lights finally turned off 10 minutes later, I remained vigilant, never letting go of the zipper inside the tent. I imagined myself as a brave soldier, protecting its post, until I eventually passed out from being tired. When morning came, I could still see my sister snoozing in her sleeping bag. That's when I flew out of the tent, zipping it back up behind me. I felt like she would be safe in the light of day, and I would be able to go get my dad. However, as I reached the patio door, I saw my sister sitting at the kitchen table, smiling while swinging her legs while she scooped up her favorite cereal. The sound of the zipper slowly opening behind me brought a wave of fear to my chest. My head turned slowly towards the tent, just in time to catch a glimpse of something running into the woods away from my house. Something with black matted hair and strange proportions. It was gone in a flash, but from what little I could see of it, I could tell it was smaller than what had been outside my tent earlier. My sister had woken up long before me that night. The click of the VHS tape coming to an end had actually woken her up, and she had gone to sleep inside, where it was warm. My cousin lived in the East Agency of the Navajo Nation, in a community known as Crown Point. She was still living with her parents at this time, and was a good girl. She had good grades, a nice ride, and was very popular that she even played on the basketball team. When she told us this story, it was very creepy, and the events that followed would also deepen my beliefs in the traditional Navajo way and the Navajo culture. My cousin was coming home from basketball practice, which ran past sunset. It was during the colder months, and so it was dark by the time she pulled into her neighborhood. She pulled into the small housing community that she lived in. It was far from a fenced community, but there were street lights, and the neighbors weren't too far from one another. As she got closer home, she saw a group of dogs. This wasn't unlikely, as there are random packs of stray dogs that roam the communities. These dogs don't belong to anyone, and they get food from wherever they can. As she got closer, she noticed that something was off about the dogs. There were 4 dogs, and they were all sitting in a circle, all facing each other. Surprisingly, this really didn't faze her until she spoke about the event later. Since this was a housing community, my cousin couldn't barrel down the road, so she slowly drove past the group of dogs and kept going on her way. As she continued to drive, she noticed from the corner of her eye that something was running alongside her car. She turned her head to see that a brown dog from the group was trotting alongside her car. This actually didn't faze her until she hit a speed bump, and the impact of the bump made her car wobble. She looked over at the dog again, still casually keeping pace with the car. She tried to ignore the dog and try speeding up, keeping in mind where the speed bumps are. The dog continued to keep pace as well. My cousin had to eventually stop at a stop sign. She began to feel uncomfortable and tried keeping her eyes ahead, but curiosity got the best of her. She looked over at the dog. It was facing straight ahead. She continued to stare, and that's when the dog turned its head. But instead of the face of a dog, there was the flat face of a man, covered in hair and smiling from ear to ear. Fear shot through her body, and my cousin pushed the pedal to the floor, not daring to look back. She finally got home and barely pulled herself in the door, weak from fear. My auntie came to her, and my cousin began to sob. She told my auntie everything, and they scheduled a meeting with a medicine man the very next day. That same night, my cousin was trying to get some rest. She was tossing and turning and felt very ill. She could hear people outside laughing and talking in Navajo, but she didn't think too much of it because they lived in a community near plenty of neighbors. The next day, the medicine man told my cousin that she was very fortunate. He said that the Skinwalker wasn't meant for her. The medicine man told her that she just happened to spot it when it was out to bring another person misfortune. He also told her that the laughing and talking that she heard in the night was the Skinwalker talking to his friends, and that he had scared her. The medicine man told my cousin that if the Skinwalker had been for her, and she had seen him like that, it could have very well killed her. After that encounter, my cousin suffered from being very ill, and she actually had to stop playing basketball for a while. She had many ceremonies, and even a cleansing performed on her, and she eventually got back on her feet. This is one of many stories that my mom always tells us about, especially when electricity goes out at night. When I ask my cousin about it, she confirms it's true, but she also doesn't like talking about it too much. She also told me that the medicine man told her not to go around and telling people about this experience, because apparently these skinwalkers can hear you, and you're basically drawing them to your home. So this will be the only time that you hear from me. Whether you believe the story or not, I would recommend not talking about skinwalkers with other people.